What happens when a city known for glitz and opportunity suddenly becomes the staging ground for one of the largest drug seizures in recent memory? Late July operations in Los Angeles and Monterey Park pulled back the curtain on a dangerous alliance between Mexican cartels and Chinese organized crime groups, exposing a criminal network with reach far beyond California. According to U.S. federal officials, more than $30 million worth of narcotics and counterfeit identity documents were taken off the streets in coordinated raids, with multiple high-ranking cartel figures placed in custody. Yet the deeper story reveals not simply an arrest operation, but a structural blow against a network that has perfected the art of moving drugs, money, and people across borders undetected. Law enforcement officials describe the raids as a textbook demonstration of intelligence-driven policing. Months of surveillance, undercover informants, and interagency cooperation allowed Immigration and Customs Enforcement (ICE) and the Drug Enforcement Administration (DEA) to dismantle a hub that had long eluded authorities. The nexus between Chinese syndicates and Mexican cartels offered both sides a win-win. Cartels ensured steady narcotic supply, methamphetamine and fentanyl being primary commodities, while Chinese groups provided money laundering channels and forged documentation that allowed operatives to blend seamlessly into U.S. communities. The significance of the July seizures cannot be overstated. Veteran analysts point out that such operations are not isolated. They function as gateway cases. Taking down a network in Los Angeles means disrupting wider corridors stretching into Chicago, New York, and Houston. With narcotics overdose deaths in the United States surpassing 100,000 annually according to CDC data, the timing of this operation underscores Washington's intent to demonstrate results. President Donald Trump, now serving his second non-consecutive term, has repeatedly framed narcotics trafficking as a national security issue, linking cartel activity to broader threats such as terrorism financing and foreign influence. International parallels sharpen the stakes. In Ukraine, Russia has expanded electronic warfare to disrupt supply chains, while in the Middle East, Israel and Iran continue to exchange strikes over weapons shipments. Analysts argue that criminal cartels often mirror such state-level tactics on a micro scale, exploiting logistics gaps, using proxy actors, and laundering funds through seemingly legitimate businesses. Just as NATO must adapt to Russia's evolving military strategy, U.S. law enforcement must evolve to keep pace with hybrid threats that blend crime, cyber tools, and geopolitical cover. Dr. Robert Bunker, a security specialist writing in Small Wars Journal, recently noted that cartel triad collaborations represent one of the most adaptive criminal fusions of the 21st century, warning that without systemic disruption, these networks could embed themselves into America's urban economies as deeply as Prohibition-era syndicates once did. His comparison resonates with historical weight organized crime in the 1920s thrived by corrupting institutions. Today's cartels exploit globalization, encrypted messaging apps, and weaknesses in border control. The Los Angeles operation is therefore more than a headline. It is a stress test for America's capacity to defend itself internally while balancing international crises abroad. Can the U.S. sustain large-scale crackdowns on cartel triad alliances while simultaneously confronting Russia in Eastern Europe and deterring China in the Pacific? And what will happen if these criminal economies begin to intersect with geopolitical rivals seeking leverage against Washington and NATO? How do sophisticated criminal syndicates hide in plain sight, weaving their operations into the very fabric of American cities? The raids in Los Angeles and Monterey Park revealed more than hidden drug caches. They exposed the intricate blueprint of how cartel triad alliances operate. At the center are seemingly ordinary businesses, nightclubs, massage parlors, and even neighborhood spas that serve as facades for an economy of narcotics, money laundering, and human exploitation. These storefronts often run cash-heavy models, making it easy to disguise illicit proceeds as legitimate revenue, a method that has challenged regulators for decades. Investigators traced money flows through layers of shell companies and cash couriers, with front businesses in California acting as collection points before funds were filtered into transnational banking systems. Experts describe the model as shadow banking, where underground financial networks bypass the US dollar and instead rely on informal value transfer systems, sometimes connected to Chinese underground banking channels that move billions globally. According to Reuters, US officials have warned that Chinese money laundering groups now dominate dominate the market, often outcompeting traditional Latin American launderers by charging lower fees and offering faster service. But the front businesses do not only launder cash, they mask darker crimes. Law enforcement sources confirmed that alongside drug profits, some venues were linked to coerced sex work, debt bondage, and human trafficking. The fusion of drug smuggling and human exploitation highlights the adaptability of these networks, creating diversified revenue streams that make them resilient to targeted enforcement. Veteran analysts stress that this mirrors the evolution of cartels in Mexico, which long ago shifted from single commodity organizations to diversified conglomerates handling drugs, oil theft, counterfeit goods, and migrant smuggling. The Monterey Park operation highlighted how these fronts were deeply embedded in local communities. Many employees and patrons were unaware they were stepping into nodes of a global criminal enterprise. That proximity makes these businesses difficult to root out without alienating immigrant neighborhoods already wary of law enforcement. For ICE and DEA, striking the right balance between enforcement and community trust remains a constant challenge. Looking beyond Los Angeles, parallels emerge in other global flashpoints. In Ukraine, hidden logistics networks sustain both the Russian and Ukrainian militaries' fuel depots disguised as civilian facilities, supply trucks masked as humanitarian convoys. In the Middle East, Iran has mastered the use of civilian airlines and cargo companies to move weapons across Syria and Lebanon. The pattern is clear whether by states or cartels. The tactic of embedding illicit flows into legitimate frameworks is a cornerstone of 21st century conflict. Western experts warn that the stakes are strategic. If cartels can launder billions through American cities without detection, adversarial states could exploit the same infrastructure for covert influence operations. The Guardian recently reported that Western intelligence agencies are monitoring overlaps between transnational criminal groups and state-backed cyber operations, raising fears that financial networks originally designed for laundering cartel money could be co-opted to evade sanctions or bankroll proxy wars. The question now is whether Washington and NATO partners are prepared to dismantle these blueprints at scale. Cutting off a single nightclub or spa does little if the architecture remains intact. What will happen if such illicit financial pipelines perfected in cities like Los Angeles are someday redirected to serve the geopolitical interests of rivals like China or Russia? What if the greatest weapon cartels possess is not just drugs or guns, but paper and plastic? The Los Angeles raids shed light on a disturbing layer of the Alliance industrial-scale identity fraud. Among the evidence seized were stacks of forged driver's licenses, counterfeit social security cards, and blank identification templates. These were not crude forgeries. They were high-quality reproductions designed to bypass routine checks. Investigators traced some of the documents back to a so-called driving school in Queens, New York, which had operated for years as a front for a print shop, producing fraudulent IDs on demand. The significance of this identity fraud cannot be understated. With authentic-looking documents, cartel couriers can rent vehicles, open bank accounts, secure apartments, and even obtain legitimate employment as cover. Law enforcement sources warned that this kind of fraud acts as a force multiplier, enabling criminal networks to scale operations while staying hidden. In many cases, multiple fake IDs are issued to a single operative, allowing them to cycle through identities if one is compromised. A veteran ICE investigator remarked, "Every fake ID is essentially a key to another door, whether that door is financial, logistical, or territorial." The downstream effects are lethal. Fake identities allow the smuggling of methamphetamine and fentanyl across state lines with less risk of detection, enabling overdose crises to intensify in American cities. The CDC recently confirmed that fentanyl remains the leading cause of overdose deaths in the United States, with numbers holding steady at over 100,000 fatalities per year. Forged documents also allow human traffickers to move victims undetected, placing vulnerable migrants into exploitative labor and sex work rings. Analysts argue that identity fraud has strategic implications far beyond crime. In Europe, NATO intelligence agencies have documented how Russian operatives use forged passports and IDs to infiltrate target countries. Similarly, in the Middle East, Iranian networks have long relied on counterfeit travel documents to smuggle operatives and weapons. By comparison, cartel triad collaborations inside the US demonstrate how the same tactics can destabilize domestic security, blurring the line between organized crime and national security threats. Western experts caution that the weakness lies not only in law enforcement capacity, but also in outdated verification systems. According to a 2025 report by the Guardian, U.S. state DMVs still lack a unified national database capable of flagging duplicate identities across multiple states. This bureaucratic gap has become fertile ground for exploitation. In effect, the patchwork system of identification in America gives transnational cartels the upper hand. For policymakers in Washington, this issue resonates with President Trump's renewed calls for tougher immigration controls and identity verification standards. In his recent address, he argued that fake IDs are not just about illegal immigrants, they are about cartels, terrorists, and criminals gaming our system. His rhetoric echoes past debates about voter ID laws and real ID implementation, but the July raids suggest that the security implications now extend far beyond politics. The larger strategic question is sobering. If criminal cartels can undermine America's identity systems, what prevents hostile foreign powers from using the same loopholes to infiltrate financial networks or critical infrastructure? And will NATO allies already burdened by Russian cyber operations and Iranian proxy warfare be able to coordinate with the US to secure the weakest link identity itself? How did drugs that start in hidden labs thousands of miles away end up devastating neighborhoods across the United States? The blueprint uncovered in Los Angeles demonstrates how modern trafficking chains function like shadow supply networks, exploiting every weak point in borders banking and migration policy. Mexican cartels provide the bulk product methamphetamine and fentanyl, while Chinese syndicates refine precursor chemicals, ship synthetic opioids, and handle laundering. Together, they create a seamless logistical pipeline stretching from clandestine labs in Sinaloa to suburban streets in Ohio. A crucial dimension of this system is the surge in irregular migration along the US-Mexico border. Cartels exploit migrant flows to mass drug couriers, and in some cases charge migrants fees to cross territory safely. According to BBC News, US border authorities reported record numbers of encounters in 2025, straining resources and giving cartels unprecedented leverage. Migrant shelters along the Rio Grande have quietly doubled as recruitment sites for smuggling networks where desperate individuals are coerced into transporting narcotics in exchange for passage. Financial infrastructure remains the lifeline of these operations. Shell corporations, often incorporated in Delaware or Nevada, provide cover for cartel-linked enterprises. These firms rely heavily on prepaid debit cards and cryptocurrency transfers to move money without triggering traditional banking alarms. A recent Reuters investigation highlighted how billions in suspicious transfers tied to Chinese mirror transactions bypass US oversight each year. These mirror systems allow traffickers to settle accounts without moving physical cash. One courier drops money in Los Angeles, another receives equivalent funds in Guangzhou, all without crossing a national border. Experts draw comparisons to how wartime logistics work under sanctions. In Ukraine, Russian forces evade Western export restrictions by using shell companies in the Caucasus and Central Asia. Similarly, in the Middle East, Iran moves weapons through civilian freight forwarders and shell companies in Dubai. The parallel underscores a disturbing truth: criminal cartels and state actors rely on strikingly similar methods to circumvent international oversight. The Los Angeles case also revealed how supply chains adapt when disrupted. Officials noted that seizures of methamphetamine shipments at the border had prompted traffickers to experiment with maritime routes, sending cargo through Pacific ports disguised as electronics or textiles. Jane's Defense Weekly recently reported on U.S. Coast Guard warnings that cartel-linked vessels are increasingly sophisticated, using stealth techniques and encrypted communication to evade patrols tactics not unlike those seen in military conflicts. Western analysts argue that the strategic implications are profound. If cartels continue to refine logistics under pressure, U.S. law enforcement risks a perpetual game of catch-up, where every successful raid only pushes traffickers into new, more advanced methods. Former DEA official Mike Vigil commented to Al Jazeera that cartels operate like multinational corporations. They adapt faster than government agencies can legislate. His statement resonates with the experience of NATO allies confronting hybrid warfare from Russia, where every new sanction or weapon delivery triggers a rapid countermeasure. The lingering question is whether U.S. agencies under President Trump's renewed mandate for law and order governance can harden border and financial systems without undermining civil liberties or global trade. If criminal pipelines are now operating with the same sophistication as state military supply lines, what does that mean for America's long-term ability to safeguard its cities while still projecting power abroad? Can American law enforcement truly keep pace with adversaries who evolve faster than the laws meant to stop them? The raids in Los Angeles illustrate the tactical ingenuity of ICE and DEA long-term surveillance wiretaps on encrypted messaging apps and synchronized warrant executions across multiple jurisdictions. Officials emphasize that without interagency coordination, dismantling such a layered criminal network would have been impossible. Yet as one seasoned federal agent noted, every success today is already being studied by traffickers to engineer tomorrow's workaround. The tactics employed in July demonstrate both progress and limits. On one hand, the seizure of $30 million in drugs, counterfeit documents, and cash disrupted a major pipeline. On the other, traffickers have begun deploying artificial intelligence to monitor border patrol patterns, using drones to scout terrain and anticipate law enforcement raids. According to Defense News, AI-driven surveillance tools are increasingly being co-opted by cartels, mirroring the technology employed by militaries in conflict zones such as Ukraine. In Eastern Europe, drones are used to map Russian troop movements. In Mexico, they map U.S. Border Patrol rotations. The parallel highlights the blurring lines between criminal ingenuity and military-grade innovation. Constraints also weigh heavily. Legal thresholds for surveillance remain high, requiring extensive evidence before wiretaps or financial seizures can be authorized. Civil liberties watchdogs argue that expanding surveillance powers risks infringing on privacy rights, particularly in immigrant communities already under scrutiny. Balancing the need for security with constitutional protections is a delicate act, one that traffickers exploit by embedding themselves within vulnerable communities. Another challenge is international cooperation. While ICE and DEA can target domestic nodes, the cartel's lifelines run through Mexico, China, and beyond. Diplomatic tensions complicate efforts, with US-China relations strained over Taiwan and the South China Sea. Securing Beijing's cooperation on curbing money laundering syndicates remains elusive. DW recently reported that European law enforcement faces similar hurdles when tracing Russian oligarch wealth, where geopolitical tensions block meaningful collaboration. Still, adaptability is not a one-way street. US agencies are experimenting with predictive analytics to anticipate cartel movements, fusing data from banking, border encounters, and social media. NATO allies in Europe are watching closely, as similar models are now used to predict Russian troop movements and Iranian drone strikes. If these tools succeed, they could shift the balance of initiative back toward law enforcement. Western analysts caution, however, that tactics alone will not secure long-term success. Without addressing root vulnerabilities, fragmented identity systems, weak border infrastructure, and loopholes in corporate registration, the cycle will repeat. Veteran experts draw comparisons to counterinsurgency campaigns. Tactical victories matter, but unless governance gaps are closed, adversaries resurface stronger. The deeper strategic question looms: can America, under Trump's renewed law and order mandate, scale these tactical innovations fast enough to stay ahead of adaptive cartels? Or will the nation face a reality where every celebrated bust only signals the next evolution of criminal tradecraft? What if the greatest threat posed by cartels and triads is not simply drugs on the street, but the slow erosion of America's internal resilience? The Los Angeles raids serve as a warning shot. Narcotics, trafficking, identity fraud, and money laundering are no longer isolated crimes, but strategic risks that undermine national security, financial integrity, and social cohesion. As one Western security official told BBC News, cartels today are behaving like geopolitical actors, shaping economies, destabilizing communities, and exploiting every weakness in governance. Urban security is already under strain. Cities like Los Angeles, Chicago, and New York bear the brunt of overdoses, gang violence, and human trafficking. With overdose deaths surpassing 100,000 annually, the crisis is no longer viewed as a public health issue alone. It is framed by the Trump administration as a national security emergency. The president's directives have emphasized treating cartels as hybrid threats, comparable in structure to insurgent groups, demanding sustained federal attention rather than ad hoc enforcement. Financial integrity stands as another front line. Experts warn that billions laundered annually through real estate shell companies and underground banking weakened the credibility of the U.S. financial system. According to Reuters, Chinese underground banking channels alone handle more than $5 billion annually tied to North American narcotics flows. Left unchecked, these networks could provide adversarial states with covert mechanisms to bypass sanctions, a scenario NATO analysts fear could undermine the effectiveness of Western economic tools against Russia or Iran. Social cohesion may be the most intangible yet devastating casualty. When local communities perceive law enforcement as either absent or overreaching, trust collapses. This erosion of confidence is precisely what cartels exploit, embedding their operations within immigrant neighborhoods while painting themselves as providers of income and security. The pattern echoes lessons from counterinsurgency populations gravitate toward whichever actor fills the governance vacuum. Unless U.S. agencies partner meaningfully with local leaders, churches, and civic organizations, enforcement alone will not dismantle these networks. Policy prescriptions now dominate the conversation. Western analysts recommend a fusion approach integrating real-time data across ICE, DEA, FBI, and local police, tightening Know Your Customer (KYC) regulations in banking and closing loopholes in corporate registrations. Licensing reforms for state DMVs are also critical as outdated ID systems remain an Achilles heel. On the community side, investment in prevention and education campaigns is vital to undercut recruitment pipelines that feed cartels a steady supply of vulnerable operatives. Internationally, Washington must also recognize that domestic resilience cannot be divorced from global conflicts. NATO's experience with Russia's hybrid warfare, Israel's ongoing struggle with Iranian proxy networks, and America's competition with China all reveal the same truth: adversaries thrive on exploiting weak systems. Criminal cartels, though not states, operate with comparable sophistication and benefit from the same vulnerabilities. As this narrative closes, the Los Angeles operation stands not as a final victory, but as an inflection point. America faces a choice: either treat cartel triad alliances as localized nuisances, or recognize them as strategic threats demanding sustained resources, political will, and international cooperation. The broader question remains: if cartels can adapt as rapidly as modern militaries can, the United States and its allies afford to respond at yesterday's pace. The late July raids in Los Angeles and Monterey Park exposed a dangerous alliance between Mexican cartels and Chinese criminal syndicates. Authorities seized over $30 million in narcotics and counterfeit identity documents, crippling a network that blended narcotics trafficking, money laundering, and human exploitation. These organizations relied on front businesses like clubs and spas to launder money-forged IDs, to mask operatives, and shell firms to fuel cross-border financial flows. The analysis reveals disturbing parallels with global conflicts. Just as Russia, Iran, and China embed covert logistics within civilian frameworks, cartels exploit migration surges, corporate loopholes, and outdated U.S. identification systems. Experts warn that these networks not only devastate communities with drugs, but also threaten national security and financial stability. While ICE and DEA demonstrated tactical ingenuity through surveillance and wiretaps, traffickers continue to adapt, deploying AI drones and encrypted finance to stay ahead. Analysts argue that only a fusion approach combining tougher KYC DMV reforms, predictive analytics, and community partnerships can outpace them. Ultimately, the raids signal a broader question: will the U.S. under President Trump's renewed law and order mandate confront cartel triad alliances with the urgency of a strategic threat, or risk being outmaneuvered by criminal actors operating with military-level sophistication?